a lot of what's in here, it turns out, is enlarged newspaper clippings, real run news stories from the events of Titanic's sinking that have now been, look at that headline, that have now been logged and chronicled for the relics that they briefly were. 2,000 lives are saved off wrecked Titanic by wireless in the Denver Times. This is the Monday evening paper on April 15th. So as we know, Titanic sunk in the wee early mornings of Monday, April 15th, after hitting an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. the evening previous. And so in these days, this is 108 years ago, there was an evening paper to keep everybody on top of what was going on locally and internationally. There was no 6 o'clock news. And so at this point, word had gotten around that, of course, Titanic sank, and that was news unto itself because she was supposed to be unsinkable. But as you can see, they got a lot of the details wrong at this point. Certainly not the 2,000 lives aboard. Not all of them made it home, not even close. But isn't that interesting? This is actually kind of one of the early instances of fake news, because it's not so much a situation of the wrong information traveling. Somebody said this wrong, because Titanic and her reputation were to be the crown jewel of the White Star Line and of the British Navy in general. And if the reputation were to come out that everything they say is not so, then it would mean very bad things for British steamships going forward and the future of travel by sea. How wireless sounded alarm and brought rescue to crippled liner. Now, there is a lot of truth to the wireless system in Titanic being, in fact, very heroic. It was one of a kind, state-of-the-art Marconi wireless radio aboard, which, in fact, broke down the night before the tragedy, the night before she had to, in fact, be used. Couple of guys tinkering around, bust the radio, and their manual, in fact, told them, look, just leave it until you arrive in New York, and then we can get the proper repairman on. You're not going to need it right now, but if you try and fix it, you're going to make it worse. Of course, they didn't have the egos to handle such an instruction, and so they did start tinkering around. Thankfully, they were able to fix the radio, and can you imagine, had they not done that, the next evening when Titanic struck an iceberg, they would not have been able to call for any local ships. As we know, Carpathia is who they were able to reach, and the remaining 700 survivors would not have been survivors. Look right there, Halifax, Nova Scotia, April 15th. Halifax is home to the largest Titanic burial ground at Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax. They were able to go in the next day, I suppose the day after the 15th, when it was better understood exactly how many lives were lost, probably the 16th. They went in with a barge and they collected the still floating dead bodies, those which they could in fact find nearest where the site was, and they sailed them to the nearest sizable commercial harbor, which was Halifax, and they had a proper burial site. This, of course, is where the now infamous J. Dawson grave site is, still occasionally the place point of flowers for DiCaprio fans. Yeah, here's April 16th. They have still not exactly correct information, but it's better information. 1,300 perished when Titanic sinks. 866 known to be rescued. Now, the first part here is forgivable. In fact, it was over 1,500 who perished. And so it's very conceivable, even now when we have incredibly tragic events, the death tallies tend to continue to rise for a long period of time after the event itself as we collect more and more information. What's so interesting is that they would go forth as to say 866 known to be rescued. It's patently untrue. They only had 700 rescued, so they miscounted or somebody got wrong information once again. Look at this very interesting image of Titanic, like sitting on top of Denver, I guess, Denver's business district. Wives dragged from husbands to safety, scantily clad women and children floating in ocean boats in sea of ice wash. I mean, it is true, of course, the rule of the sea was followed, women and children first. Now, this is the Wednesday paper, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. No additions to the list of Titanic survivors given. So, according to this, they're still dealing with the 1,300 deaths that they knew before. The survivors still in the 800 range, which we now say is wrong. Franconia says 700 saved. So here we have on the front page of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle a dispute over exactly how many people have survived, and Franconia is more correct. Got a little image of Nova Scotia right here as they tried to illustrate exactly where Titanic sank based on what they can determine. In fact, she rests about 500 kilometers away from Newfoundland. Newfoundland tends to be the main touchstone when we're trying to verbally describe where Titanic sits now, just because that is technically the largest landmass nearby. Nova Scotia does have a stronger relationship to the story of Titanic. Titanic's bulkheads proved unreliable, and so here's where some of the explanations of exactly what went wrong are starting to take form. That is true. Titanic is equipped with, goodness, I forget now. I think it's 12 watertight compartments in her hull, and she's only able to contain the flooding of, say, 3 of them. I have those numbers incorrect, but just barely she cracked one too many. And they flooded, and of course that dragged her down below the water. If this should prove correct, the total number of dead would reach 1,490. Well, it's more than that. Now here we have an update. How's that for a headline? Liner Titanic sinks, 866 passengers saved. Now this is almost amusing because this paper claims to know now of 1,500 deaths, which is the closest truth we've seen in these newspapers so far, but they're sticking to that 866 survivors number, which is especially ridiculous because there were not 2,400 people aboard the Titanic. You'd think they could have at least that much information. And so this is where they start to collect some of the survivors. Now, if they know of 866 survivors, why can't they list all of them? They've got a small selection of them here. A smudge in the photocopy. Titanic, the largest, most luxurious, vaunted as the safest steamer that ever sailed the seas, collided with an iceberg at 10:45. That's incorrect. At a latitude, they do have some of the coordinates here. No, not 10:45 p.m. It was 11:40, 11:41 perhaps. So, hey, look, they know right here there were 2,200 souls aboard. So why don't their two numbers match up? Now, we're kind of hovering in the same date range here. Some of these are chronologically out of order. We're back at Tuesday the 16th, but interestingly, this New York Herald, there's so many different New York papers. This one is with roughly different numbers. Yet again, 1,800 persons aboard. It's not true. Then they could have done a little more research to determine that. 675 of her passengers saved. That is, in fact, pretty close to true. Look at some of these people here. Fascinating that they have photographs. We've got John Jacob Astor. He's one of my favorite people aboard Titanic, one of my favorite Titanic figures. He was the wealthiest person aboard Titanic. If you're aware of New York real estate, the borough Astoria is named after the Astor family. Fascinating person who'd recently been divorced, and he was sailing on Titanic with his new wife. She was pregnant. It was somewhat scandalous. He was in his 50s. She was in her early 20s, if not her late teens. And John Astor did, in fact, perish aboard Titanic. His wife survived. He ushered her through a little porthole. As I said, she was pregnant. The unborn baby survived as well and went on to be known as the Titanic baby. And then after he secured his wife aboard a lifeboat, J.J. Astor went and decided he was going to create some mayhem. He knew he was going to stay aboard until it was completely underwater. And to create more panic, he went down to the kennel and unleashed all the cats and dogs just so there would be more mayhem aboard Titanic. And they were, in fact, able to identify John Astor's body because his initials were sewn into his clothes. He was one of the bodies they were able to retrieve. Of course, so many bodies were unrecognizable once they were retrieved, and so many people were presumed dead because they were never seen again or never identified. But not everybody wore threads like John Astor. Isidor Strauss, he and his wife Ida died together aboard Titanic. His wife was also offered a seat on a life raft. She refused to leave him, and so they died in bed together. They owned Macy's department store. Oh, there's Mrs. Astor. And here we have, oh goodness. We got Captain E.J. Smith. And here's another really fascinating figure in Titanic lore. J. Bruce Ismay was essentially the owner of Titanic. It was property of J.P. Morgan, but Bruce Ismay conceived of Titanic. It was very important to him and his ego, the satisfaction of his ego, that they build the greatest and most unstoppable ocean liner ever. He was the managing director of White Star Line, who were the parent company of Titanic's registry. And so the legend goes, it was Bruce Ismay so hung up on what the headlines would print about Titanic. And as we know, the headlines were, they certainly sold newspapers, although not in the way he wanted. He wanted to be able to boast about his shipping company. And so he pressured, so the story goes, allegedly pressured Captain Smith to sail Titanic faster. That Captain Smith was very comfortable sailing her at 21 knots for the large duration of the journey. Bruce Ismay, knowing she was fully capable of sailing at 23, encouraged Captain Smith to go faster, to light all the boilers so that perhaps they could arrive in New York a day early and have something to boast about. The interesting thing about shipping law at the time is if you arrive early, you are not allowed to dock until you said you were going to come in. And so if Titanic arrived a whole day early, they would have to moor in New York Harbor and just sit there as a monument to their speed for the next 24 hours so that everyone in the city would be able to see just how fast she was and how quickly she arrived. Of course, what's reckless about driving Titanic too quickly, in particular through an ice field, is that you're not able to pivot quickly enough. So if in fact that's what happened, it was partly J. Bruce Ismay's hubris that caused so much death. Now, he was also the highest-ranking survivor of Titanic's crash, was seen climbing into a lifeboat out of turn, not following the women and children rule, and went on to live a life of tremendous shame. He was never really able to reasonably answer inquiries about just how he managed to survive ahead of so many widows' husbands. He got gout of the leg or something and died a fairly sick man. Now here we have a bunch of other photographs of people, I guess people who died aboard Titanic. I don't recognize everybody's name here. And of course I'm keeping my eye out for Molly Brown. Titanic sent out warning of icebergs 1 hour before the crash. That is true. These same cocky radio men were sent a transmission saying, look, where you're sailing is a little bit dangerous. Be very careful. And what did the boys aboard Titanic say? They said, shut up, I'm busy. And obviously, we wish they'd heeded the warning. Nations of world to move for safeguarding passengers. Iceberg patrol to be started. This is the one silver lining to the tragedy of Titanic is, of course, with so few lifeboats, new travel law had to be instated afterward that if you're going to have this many people aboard your ship, you have to have exactly enough lifeboats, if not more. And so, definitely lives were saved after the 700 were lost. Here's Molly Brown. The unsinkable Molly Brown. Definitely a hero that evening who encouraged the, well, I don't want to say her shipmates, but her boatmates as they rowed away to rescue, to turn around and go fish some of the floundering people in the water out of the water. And surely she and her stridence, her formidable spirit saved a lot of lives that evening. It's Mr. Strauss again. Mrs. J.J. Astor named among the survivors. Of course, it would have been Vincent Astor. It would have been known fairly early on that someone as prestigious as John Astor didn't survive. It's some of the some of the less wealthy, some of the less noteworthy people whose status was a mystery for a long, long time. And because communication was not so simple in those days, there were many people who were aware of a loved one aboard the Titanic and just had to wait for hopefully good news that in many cases never came. And sometimes you just had to come to that determination on your own, which of course is so sad. This one's pretty cool. Got a nice little picture of some of the highest ranking naval members of the crew. Of course, we've talked about E.J. Smith. On the left-hand side here, we've got William McMaster Murdoch, who's a fascinating figure in the tragic story of Titanic. It was first made, and in fact, he was the one on duty when Titanic hit the iceberg. Now, there's a little bit of speculation about exactly when the ship started to turn, when he in command, Mr. Murdoch, decided they were going to have to act very quickly. Of course, it's well reported that the gentleman in the crow's nest saw the iceberg, they make their call, iceberg straight ahead, and then they decide to pull a hard to starboard. But in hindsight, some people who were able to recall seem to think that maybe the ship was already turning at that point. And so it's very possible that Murdoch already knew and had it, not under control, but he was doing all he could. Really a very heroic figure that evening, and in fact, not somebody who chose to waste too much time on the women and children rule. It was much more important to Murdoch that he just fill boats, because one of the problems is that they had so few boats and they weren't even filling them to capacity, and Murdoch had no time for that. If you were standing there, he was going to put you in a lifeboat. Now, something that's kind of sad and frustrating about Murdoch is that there is a little bit of a conspiracy theory that he was not entirely virtuous in the upheaval of the moment. Now, he doesn't survive, and he was never found. So we don't exactly know how Murdoch died. But Second Officer Lightoller said later in an account, in a radio interview, which you can in fact listen to on YouTube, it's fascinating. He wouldn't say exactly who it was, but he saw a friend of his commit suicide that evening. He admitted that. He also saw the same friend shoot someone else on deck. And this is why in James Cameron's Titanic movie, Mr. Murdoch is depicted, he's dramatized as, in the heat of the moment, shooting a passenger to get out of the way, and then shooting himself. And there is really no documentation, there's no reason to believe it was Murdoch who did this, other than this one vague memory by Mr. Lightoller. And so, what we do know for a fact is that Murdoch was heroic, and Murdoch's surviving family and now his descendants take a lot of pride in that. And so, when he was depicted as so flawed, perhaps wrongfully in James Cameron's movie, which otherwise took such great efforts to be factual, they were quite insulted by James Cameron's movie. And in hindsight, James Cameron apologized to the family and says he regrets that particular dramatization of Mr. Murdoch. This is another sad chapter in the ironic tale of Titanic, that the crew was not sufficiently drilled before the disaster. In fact, of course, they were supposed to be. Titanic struck an iceberg the evening of a Sunday, sank in the early hours of a Monday. And yes, the morning of the day of the disaster, there was supposed to be a lifeboat drill. And so in this case, maybe all the other crewmen who were insufficiently filling the far too scarce lifeboats would not have been so haphazard about it had they been properly drilled. Surely they had been given enough instruction, but they did cancel a lifeboat drill that morning simply because it was Sunday morning. And they had church services aboard Titanic, and they figured people would rather go to church. More reported about J.J. Astor. Now, it's a New York paper, and so it's not hard to imagine why. This is the wealthiest man aboard Titanic, and thus he was the most famous man aboard Titanic. If you're wealthy and an aristocrat, especially an American aristocrat, you were as good of a celebrity before the time of movies. And so, of course, that was kind of the main talking point, other than the fact that roughly this many people are dead. John Jacob Astor was among passengers who went down with the ship, it says, according to a wireless dispatch received by Bradstreet's last night from the from the liner Olympic. Olympic was Titanic's sister ship. In fact, almost identical to Titanic in size and stature. And at the time, legend. It's so interesting that we remember Titanic as this like one-of-a-kind masterwork of size, its godly stature, and when in fact it was the second ship to look and float with almost the same magnitude. Titanic like weighed a little bit more because one of her promenade decks had an awning on it, so it weighed like 1,000 pounds more. But her sister ship Olympic was otherwise the same. Look at this ridiculous picture, by the way. Like this is the early days of Photoshop, I guess. They don't have a photograph of Titanic pressed up against an iceberg. First of all, this is a head-on collision, which is not what Titanic experienced. It was a large gash in her hull, but somebody just like created this strange photo. It's a doctored photo is what it is. Bizarre.